Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we get started, congrats on making it to your last lecture series of this course. I know it's a pretty busy time in the semester, so I hope you're all doing all right with that, getting your stuff done. Only a couple weeks left. But anyways, let's get into this topic here. So if you recall, we started out with biological and evolutionary pressures in the first few weeks of this class. Now we are going to transition to and end with the nurture side of things as opposed to nature. And so we'll be going over various influences of things like social pressures and social norms. And so the first lecture here will be about the cultural influences on motivation. And so we can think about this somewhat similarly to the effects of evolution. And so with evolution, we are talking about the passing down of genes, right? With culture, we're more getting at the passing down of ideas. And so kind of a bad but simple example is our memes. And so obviously, how that works is if someone finds a meme that they think is funny or amusing in some way, or whatever the reason might be, they send that to their friends and a bunch of other people, right? And that meme keeps getting passed around for years and years sometimes. And so, somewhat similarly, right? Ideas that have been beneficial in the past can be passed down through culture. And one large component of culture are environmental constraints. And so these constraints can lead to certain behaviors becoming beneficial, and then those beneficial behaviors get passed on. And so, one way to think about this, some people have done statistical modeling for this type of thing. And so, let's think about this area here as a some type of a geographical area, right? And so we have different villages, and let's just say for this example that the circles shaded black are hostile villages versus the circles shaded white are peaceful villages. And so by hostile, I just mean that these villages will invade other villages and steal their crops, things like that in this example. Um, Seems a little ridiculous when looking at circles, but stick with me here. And so the idea is that with these environmental constraints, being surrounded by hostile versus peaceful other villages will have an influence on how any given village itself will react. And so through this modeling, we see obviously a stark difference here between day 1 and day 14. And so what this is getting at is, let's say this village here, which is shaded white, so it's a peaceful one, but it's surrounded by hostile villages. And so when it's surrounded by hostile villages, getting raided all the time, right? A defense mechanism that's going to be likely to pop up in this originally peaceful village is to become more hostile in order to defend oneself and protect from these other hostile invading villages, right? And so then through this model and theory leads to this. And day 14, based on this model, we can think about this just generally where we get a clump that then the left side geographically here is more hostile and the right side is more peaceful based on what we talked about. And additionally, on the flip side of that, if a given village is surrounded by peaceful villages, even if it started out as hostile, it may be more beneficial to that village to end up becoming peaceful as well and go for things like collective gains and cooperation um, and strategies of that nature. So, anyways, just an example here of how certain cultures can come to be based on environmental constraints using this aggression example here. And so also, finally, let's say, you could be a sociologist. And if a sociologist were to come and look at this, there are a couple of different ways of explaining this, right? It can either be oh, this is probably innate biological differences. This area has always been this way. These villages were always hostile versus, well, maybe these um, certain villages became hostile or peaceful based on the environmental constraints that surrounded them. Moving away from how various cultures come to be, let's get into some basic motivations and differing motivations across cultures, although that's likely not a completely accurate statement in the sense that we can think about this in a similar nature to personality. And so it's not that the motivations across cultures are necessarily different, right? It's that the same motivations are pursued in different ways. And so, again, we kind of got a sense of that in the personality section as well. And so, for some examples here, we all have needs for belonging, right? We all need food, but we approach these things in different ways. Same with control and self-esteem. We'll get into some specific examples of these. Achievement, whatever it might be. And so, anyways, across cultures, general basic motivations seem to be relatively consistent, but the expression of these motives and how we act towards pursuing these motives varies. And so I think probably the easiest, most obvious example here is food. And so each culture has different, although oftentimes overlapping, still different culinary tastes. We even eat at different times. We eat different amounts. That's what this is getting at here. So even we can look at the same restaurants. So a restaurant in Paris, a restaurant in Philadelphia, or France and America. And so the sample sizes, number of items samples differs across these different regions and cultures. Generally speaking, these sample sizes tend to be larger in the United States. Additionally, we can look at this in terms of cultural differences and love. Again, we all have these, love or belongingness needs. However, let's move CJ out of the way here. Everyone has basic needs, but the pursuit is different. And so in this study, where this chart here is coming from, American and Chinese participants wrote a narrative of a recent time that they fell in love. And basically the researchers were looking for various comments about characteristics and the partner in terms of why they like that individual. And so, findings basically showed that Americans talked a decent amount about familiarity and how that was important to them versus these Chinese participants talked more about personality, filling needs, physiological arousal feelings, and yeah, things of that nature. We also see cultural differences in how we perceive the self. This is kind of not kind of, it is a large one here in the realm of psychology. And so there are differences in self-control. So there can be independent self-control. This is where one might focus on unique traits and attributes like I'm smart, funny, athletic, kind, things like that. Versus there, on the flip side, there can be interdependent self-control. And so this is more focused on relationships with others as opposed to our own traits and attributes. So I'm a father, a daughter, a brother. Yeah, things of that nature. Relative to others, getting at that interdependent piece. And so what we see is that we see some just very general differences between Western societies and Eastern societies when it comes to this construal, although, of course, when you look at Western and Eastern areas, this varies within each of those extremely broad areas as well. But just a general point here that Western society, so Western Europe, like places like Germany or America or ancient Greece, tend to be more individualistic, or in other words, focus on the independent self-control, versus Eastern society tends to be more collectivistic. Places like Japan, China, modern Greece. So Greece is actually changed a bit, moving from independent to interdependent self-control. But anyways, these more collectivistic areas tend to focus on interdependent self-control. And so this has various influences on how we perceive and approach things. A couple of examples here. Westerners tend to prefer uniqueness or the minority figure, especially when unique. So just for a simple example in this chart here, the Westerners, when asked the random question of which, shape or whatever you prefer, would tend to, so an example A would prefer this kind of crooked or changed one here relative to the others. Same with the triangles, would tend to rate a preference for this object here. And less so when looking at part B, because multiple components are different from the rest. Or in other words, are a bit less unique. And so here we see a lot of uniqueness in terms of the differences of these minority figures. Finally, we have cultural differences in control striving as well. And so in Western societies, we tend to see more disjoint agency or focus on individual contributions versus in Eastern society, the tendency is to focus on the contributions of others, or what we call a conjoint agency. And so an example of that could be disjoint agency or individual contributions. If you're watching a sport, let's say football, you might focus on, and what tends to be focused on is the quarterback in terms of blaming a team for good plays, bad plays, wins, losses, things like that. On the flip side, for conjoint agency, the focus would be on the team coming together, everyone doing their part, believing, things like that. Could also pick a different sport, basketball, soccer, whatever you want to choose here, I guess is. So for soccer, you could focus on the person who kicked the game-winning goal. That would be destroy agency, versus you could focus on what the team did as a whole for the 90 minutes or however long it went. And that would be the conjoint agency. Interestingly, we see this kind of bias in psychologists and how psychologists talk about control striving. And what I mean by this is or psychologists label contributions as either primary or secondary, and we tend to say that individual contributions are primary versus the contributions of others are secondary, but nothing about either of these things is primary or secondary, comes first or second. It just depends on however you want to categorize these two things, because neither are innately primary or secondary. All right, that's it for this video. Next, we'll get into some gender differences in personality.